About 3 months before Greg died, he celebrated his 59th birthday. And I don't think any of us were aware that the end of Greg's life was so close. His body, of course, was by then weakened by 4 years of constant medication and by 5 surgeries, by the cancer itself that had metastasized throughout his body and was gradually taking over his vital organs. But you know what? His spirit was ablaze. It was as if Greg, by this time, transformed himself into a being of light with nothing but a heart burning with loving kindness for all that crossed his path. And when he was first diagnosed 4 years before, he'd only been given about 6 months to live. If the drugs worked and he was lucky, it could extend to 2 years. But Greg had survived 4 years, so 4 years is really very lucky. My large extended family gathered to celebrate his 59th birthday. He was acutely aware that this was his last birthday. In my family, Greg's nickname was Pastor Parker. And this was because he was often the designated speaker at family events. So it came as no surprise that Greg had a little speech planned for this special event. And we wondered what words of wisdom, what lofty thoughts was he going to share with us, you know, at this time of his heightened spirituality. And there was a hush that fell over this very noisy group of my family. But what we didn't realize was that Greg had a surprise planned for us. Now, before I tell you what happened next, I'm going to digress just a little bit. And I'm going to tell you about Greg's 3 main interests and loves. These things Greg was absolutely devoted to. Above all else was his devotion to God. And this started at a very young age when he was educated by the Christian brothers, the good sort. They planted the seeds of faith in his heart, and these seeds grew into, I would say, a mighty tree when he turned his attention to the Baha'i teachings. So that was his main interest in life, and his first love, really. His second great love should have been me, but it wasn't. It was football. Not playing football, but watching it and talking about it and shouting instructions to the players in what looked to me like fits of complete psychosis every time his team was playing. And Greg's third great love, and I still don't make it to this list, Star Trek and Lord of the Rings. He just loved the stories and the lofty themes so beautifully portrayed in the stories of Star Trek and Lord of the Rings. And he used them in his jokes and in his own talks, and more on this later. Now, we go back to his last birthday, his 59th birthday, and as we prepared ourselves for Pastor Parker's lofty thoughts, a hush fell over the crowd. Now remember, this was my family, so that was a big feat, that a hush could fall over the crowd. But you know what? Instead of sharing with us some very deep, profound spiritual insights that perhaps he learned through his years of adversity, Greg told us a story. Guess from where? Lord of the Rings. My sister Padma by this time was looking rather bemused because she loved Greg to bits, but she didn't really share his obsession with fantasy. The story that Greg told us at this time was of a king by the name of Theoden, who was facing a no-win scenario. And the forces of evil had gathered. And it was a mighty, undefeatable army. Nevertheless, King Theoden was determined to lead his army into battle, even though certain death awaited them. The king was determined to die with honor. And as the king faced his troops, he urged them forward with passion and with zeal to face the enemy. And they chanted, to death, as they rode towards their foes. And needless to say, they all died. Well, most of them died. And it was a sad tale, but it was as if they were victorious because of their valor. Now, as Greg told this story, he chanted these words with the same zeal that King Theoden showed in the movie. And then, to Padma's extreme horror, he invited all of us to join him, and with fists pumping in the air, "To death! To death!" And that's how Greg celebrated his last birthday, getting the family to join him as we all chanted, "To death!" Everyone except Padma, who had her hands folded across her chest, refused, absolutely refused. Why did Greg do this? Like King Theoden, Greg was facing a no-win scenario, certain death, and he chose to face it head on. He gathered us, his troops, and we charged forward together with valor, chanting "To death." So he chose to respond to this untimely death with honor, with courage, with drama, with humor. Perhaps he had internalized this message in the Baha'i writings. Death proffereth the cup that is life indeed. It bestoweth joy and is the bearer of gladness. It conferreth the gift of everlasting life. And so we come to the first of the 7 or 8 lessons that I'd like to share from Greg's life. And that first lesson is, in every situation, we have a choice. We can always choose our response. The title of this presentation is Spiritual Lessons Learned from a Life of a Larrikin. And Greg was often called a larrikin. What is a larrikin? It actually means a badly behaved young man, a troublemaker. Now, the Greg Parker that some of you here knew was a gentle, humble man, at peace with God, with himself, loving life, but accepting that his time was nearly up. I want to share with you a glimpse of the Greg of most of his life. Not that guy. The other guy was volatile. He was passionate. And this was displayed in many, many contexts, including how he drove a car. This meant that riding in a car with Greg was about as exciting as a roller coaster ride and probably a fair bit more stressful. He wasn't a man to be trifled with on the roads. But the 18-year-old Greg, the one that I never met, was by all accounts really something. He was described as unwashed and rude, a bit of an arrogant pig. Greg denies being unwashed, but he used to take pleasure in what he called his forthright manner. Now, this was also a young man who was sacked from his first job, not because of his standard of work, but because he was late every single day for a year. This was a young man who lost his license, not once, not twice, but 3 times. This was a young man who drank way too much beer. This was a young man who stole cars, not actually for the cars. He would park the stolen car a few streets down and leave it there just to mess with the guys who own the car. This was a young man who had way too many girlfriends, and a young man who was incredibly opinionated. So opinionated that he was of the opinion at the age of 16 that he didn't need to go to school anymore. He'd had enough of schooling. So he quit school, didn't tell anyone. He would leave every day with his school bag on his shoulder as if he was going to school, and his mum thought that's what he was doing, but he'd actually got himself a job. No one in their right mind would have expected that guy to become a goody two-shoes, non-drinking, non-car stealing Baha'i. But you know what? This was also the young man who read the Bible from cover to cover, Old Testament to the end of the New Testament, at a young age, because he liked the war stories. And he was incredibly proud to be the top of his class in Latin. And this was also the young man who was so arrogant that he studied the Baha'i faith because he was convinced he could prove them wrong. He was absolutely convinced. So I want to share with you now the story of how Greg became a Baha'i. And I want to share it with you mostly in his own words. So Greg's words. I was off on a mission to save Marnie's soul. Marnie was the girlfriend of my mate Graham, who hated religion with a passion and was beside himself with worry that she might become a religious freak. From my point of view, religion was fine, but I presumed the Baha'i faith wasn't a real religion like Christianity. There were a few cults around at the time, and I had already pigeonholed the Baha'is as deluded, brainwashed members of some weird cult. I suspected Mani was in danger of being duped by the Baha'is, and it was my noble task as her self-appointed savior to expose them for what they really were. I suppose at the back of my mind, I knew there would be no match for a man who won the Sacred Heart of Jesus statue for religious knowledge at the age of 9. Now, Baha'is have an event called a fireside. Basically, it consists of having an informal chat about the meaning of life in someone's home. So in order to save Mani's soul, I had to go to these firesides. My host at the first one was a lady called Nola. I remember thinking that Nola's daughter was quite good looking. So I quickly got into an argument with her, but I failed to impress her, strangely. Nola told me that back then I was unwashed and arrogant. Now, 20 minutes later, I was arguing about everything from the equality of men and women to Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. I was 18 at the time. It was 1973, and tact was not my strong point. I came away from Nola's fireside pretty pleased with myself. In my mind, I was thinking, I won! And I couldn't wait to go back for more. Now, Greg goes on to describe the many, many books he read at this time. Remember, this was a highly opinionated 18-year-old high school dropout, okay? But the books included very heavy-duty Baha'i sacred texts, like the Book of Certitude and Some Answered Questions. For those of you who don't know, these are thick books written in the 19th century in Old English. So they're not something that an 18-year-old high school dropout would really appreciate, I don't think. But he loved them. He also studied a book called Thief in the Night, in which the author makes a case for how the Baha'i teachings elegantly fulfill biblical prophecies. But he didn't take what he read on face value. He checked every single claim in the book meticulously to see if it matched with what the Bible said. He kept attending firesides, and he felt exhilarated. But no, not from what he was learning. He was exhilarated because he felt his arguments were so clever against the Baha'i faith and that he was winning, because he argued for the sake of it. In his own words, I had no problem saying rubbish or bull, and frequently did. I argued about everything, taking an opposing stance just for the sake of an argument, even if I didn't know anything about the subject. So what were these teachings that got Greg so fired up? They must have been pretty weird, right? Well, they were things like the equality of men and women. Now, the Baha'i faith, for those of you who don't know, was founded in the 19th century in Persia, present-day Iran, by a Persian nobleman by the name of Baha'u'llah. Not the sort of place or situation one would associate with spreading ideas on the equality of the sexes. And it's no wonder that Baha'u'llah was tortured, he was imprisoned, and he was banished for his teachings. But in this day and age, who can argue with it? Who can argue with the equality of men and women? Well, Greg found a way. Another teaching, the oneness of religion. Baha'is believe that all religions come from the same divine source. And we call this phenomenon progressive revelation. This implies that religion is progressively revealed by God as a way of providing guidance to humanity. It's a pretty cool teaching, and it doesn't deny the basic universal truths that underpin all faiths. Instead, it explains them. Greg found a way to argue with this one as well. Another one, the harmony of science and religion. Now, as a scientist myself, before I discovered that I was really quite bad at it and I became an artist, which I'm sort of reasonable at, I love this principle. Baha'u'llah, again back in the 19th century, taught that one without the other, science without religion, is pretty dangerous. One way you get superstition, the other way you get pure materialism. In fact, the Baha'i teachings describe science as the most noble of all human virtues and the discoverer of all things. But Greg found a way to argue with this one as well. He basically argued with everything, and probably the fact that Baha'is abstain from alcohol most of all. Now let's go back to Nola's house in 1974 and find out what happened next. Greg's words. A couple of weeks after that first fireside, I was back at Nola's house. She gave me a card called a declaration card. Basically, a declaration card is where you declare yourself your belief in Baha'u'llah's message. You sign it, and you're officially recorded as a Baha'i. Nola was pretty cool. She said, no pressure, just hang on to it and sign it when you're ready. So I tucked it into my wallet, and I forgot all about it. But I kept going back to these firesides for months. And then one night, I met this guy, and something happened. This guy was not a Baha'i, and he sat there spitting all sorts of venom against the Jews. And I listened impatiently as the Baha'is listened very patiently and politely, and it dawned on me as I listened that they were always courteous, no matter how much rubbish they listened to. After a while, I couldn't take it. These Baha'is were just too polite to this clown, so I interjected. You know what your problem is, mate? And before he could answer, I said, your problem is you're a bloody bigot. You're talking complete rubbish. And I got stuck into him in no uncertain terms. And later that night, I realized I had changed. I was actually quoting the Baha'i teachings to this bigot. When did that happen? It dawned on Greg then that somehow he had absorbed the beautiful Baha'i teachings, and with his typical arrogance, he was talking about them as if he made them up himself. It was actually a life-changing moment for Greg. He realized that it was time to have a look at that card that Nola had given him months ago and to sign it and officially declare himself a Baha'i. But there was one problem. He was going to have to give up the grog. So he got his mates together and announced this was the end. They all went to the pub, and he got terribly drunk for the last time, and he went home, threw up, and went to bed. And that was April 22nd, 1974. Back to Greg's words. The next morning, I woke up feeling like death. My eyes hurt, my head hurt. In fact, my eyes felt like they were bleeding. My breath was putrid, my mouth was a sewer, but I pulled out that declaration card, and I signed it. And that evening, I was back at Nola's house. You won't believe this. I was back at Nola's house, a secret in my wallet. And as usual, I started arguing. But halfway through, I announced, well, you lot aren't convincing me, but it doesn't matter because I've decided to become a Baha'i anyway. And that was pretty well it. This is what Greg looked like that night. Perhaps this unlikely massive internal shift that happened to that arrogant young man was at least in part because his anger and his rudeness was met with a kindly tongue. And this is Baha'u'llah's advice to us. Consort with all men in a spirit of friendliness and fellowship. If ye be aware of a certain truth, if ye possess a jewel of which others are deprived, share it with them in a language of utmost kindliness and goodwill. If it be accepted, your object is attained. If anyone should refuse it, leave him unto himself. Beware lest ye deal unkindly with him. A kindly tongue is the fountain of the light of wisdom and understanding. And so this brings us very nicely to lesson number 2. Be kind, especially to the arrogant and the unwashed. As the years progressed, Greg found himself equally comfortable sitting in the desert sands with his indigenous brothers and sisters up north, chatting with the governor down in Perth. Greg was an extrovert, and at home and at work and in the Baha'i community, he wouldn't hesitate to go where angels fear to tread. Greg appeared to be fearless. But what can we learn from this? We tend to admire the fearless, don't we? I certainly admired it in Greg. We were so different because I was terrified of almost everything. And one of Greg's favorite mantras was, I fear nothing, which he borrowed from Worf. his favorite Klingon warrior. In actual fact, I have no idea if Greg was as fearless as he seemed, but what I knew for sure was that he was always prepared to face any challenge, and this may not have been the same thing. For example, when we were first married, when we were walking down the streets of the city at night, I used to wonder why he didn't pay me much attention. After all, we were young and we were in love, and I was delightful to be with. But he always seemed distracted, until one day he explained why. He was scanning the streets for dodgy people and making sure that we avoided them. He was prepared. When he was 18 years old and off to save his friend's girlfriend from the strange Baha'i cult, he attended the meetings, he studied the texts, he checked the prophecies, he read the difficult Baha'i books just to prove them wrong, but he went prepared. Besides Greg's music, his greatest arena of service, I think, was his devotion to teaching children and youth. And Greg did this with consistent perseverance for decades. And he traveled in the city, but also he traveled up and down the length of Western Australia, this huge state, and he would visit remote Indigenous communities, and he would work with the children. No matter what, Greg prepared all of his lessons, taking hours and hours before each and every class to research his material. If it was for 2 children or for 20 children, Greg was prepared. And he became a sought-after speaker, and he never turned down a request to address a gathering. But in the early days of his public speaking, he actually wrote out all of his talks in capital letters by hand, word for word. And he continued his studies of the world's religions so that he was prepared. Eventually, Greg could stand up in front of a crowd. Didn't matter if it was 10 people, 10,000 people, and he could speak with no apparent preparation. But he'd been preparing for years. I think he used all of his interests and his resources to serve humanity, whether it was his obsession with football, which meant he could talk to any Australian on this common point of interest, or his interest and his awareness of politics, not to be partisan, but just to be informed, or his love for the Bible, both the Old and the New Testaments, which as a child he would read, as I said, just for the war stories. In fact, his knowledge and his scholarship of the Judeo-Christian texts was such that when we visited Jerusalem back in 1986, and in Jerusalem, every stone has a story, and most of them are in the Old Testament, Greg was able to match and even educate our tour guide. She marveled at his knowledge. She couldn't believe that not only was this Greg's first visit to Israel, it was his first time outside of Australia. Now, remember I mentioned that Baha'u'llah was the founder of the Baha'i faith? Baha'u'llah said many cool things, and one of Greg's favorites was this advice: be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age ye live in, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements. The meaning of exigency is need or demand, and I think Greg was a master at this. He was aware of the needs of this age that we live in. He studied its exigencies and demands, and he prepared himself to engage with anyone on them. And so I think we can learn a profound and simple thing from this. Let's not blindly sail through our lives, never examining or challenging our beliefs. Instead, let's examine what we think we know. Let's look at it from all angles. Whatever we believe, whatever we are committed to, let's know it well enough to have it stand up to scrutiny, to be challenged, to defend it. Let's care. Let's be prepared. And that's lesson number 3 from Greg's life. Now, in July 2010, Greg was diagnosed with stage 4 renal cell carcinoma with metastases. The translation of that is Greg had terminal kidney cancer, and it had spread. The thing is, our home life by this stage was already a kind of hell because our daughter Mary had been suffering from severe anorexia and depression. Now, you may not know this, but anorexia has some horrifying statistics attached to it, and too many people die from anorexia. So Greg and I we had spent the last 3 years of our lives literally trying to keep Mary safe and alive. And now, terminal cancer was thrown into the mix. In the very, very early days of Greg's diagnosis, amidst a lot of tears and prayers and fear and uncertainty, Greg grappled to come to terms with what this diagnosis meant. And I watched as he wrestled with this terminal cancer diagnosis in order to reach a state of acceptance. And this was really not easy for someone who loved life more than anyone I knew. But there was one idea that seemed to hold him steady and propel him forward through the fear. And this idea was, instead of asking, "Why me?" he asked, "Why not me?" Learning acceptance began there, but it wasn't a smooth journey. It was more like a day-to-day renewal of the idea that this was his condition. And as much as he hoped and prayed and wished for the cancer drugs to work, to keep the tumors from growing, to extend his life beyond the 6 months that was predicted, this was his condition. Right now, and accepting his disease gave him the best chance of winning what he saw as a spiritual battle. And so it was that the transformation of Greg Parker, which a process that began at the age of 18 when he set out to save Marnie's soul, it suddenly hit warp drive at the age of 55. I think it felt like Greg was engaged in some kind of mystical dance between the paradox of having both hope and practicing acceptance. And somehow, mysteriously, as the years went by, the years that were laden with victories and emotional anguish and unbearable pain and anguish and suffering, Greg mastered this dance between hope and acceptance. Such that by the time Greg died, it was clear that he had reached, I think, the epitome of acceptance. And he transformed it into radiant acquiescence. Now, the word acquiescence is defined as the acceptance of things without protest. Radiant acquiescence takes it to a whole new level, and the term comes from a beautiful Baha'i passage. The confirmations of the Spirit are all those powers and gifts which some are born with, but for which others have to strive with infinite pains. They come to that man or woman who accepts his life with radiant acquiescence. And one of the clearest signs that Greg had mastered this radiant acquiescence happened like this. Across the 4 years, every few months, he underwent a complete scan to check if the tumors were still growing. If the scans showed that the tumors were stable, it meant that the drugs were working. And that bought him a little bit of time. If the tumors were growing, it meant that the drugs had stopped working and his days were numbered, and he would perhaps have only weeks to live. So going to the hospital to see Dr. Kynan Feeney, his oncologist, and get the scan results, they were literally a matter of life and death for us. I remember those visits like they were yesterday. We would set out for the hospital, wheelchair packed in the back of the car, and then I would find a parking spot as close as possible to Kynan's office and assemble the wheelchair and get Greg out of the car, and then I would push the wheelchair towards Greg's fate, our fate, the scan results. My stomach would be churning and I would feel the nausea mounting. But you know what? Greg always appeared calm and unconcerned. And occasionally towards those last few months, I would ask him as I wheeled him, "How are you feeling, Gregory?" I was thinking that maybe this time he would say something that reflected perhaps the terror that I was feeling. Inevitably, Greg would reply with some version of this response, often in a very cheery tone. "I'm feeling good, Mal. I'm feeling calm, confident. It is what it is, Mal. It is what it is." And I was completely baffled by this. At the time, I actually barely understood what was going on right in front of my eyes, that the man I was married to was transforming into somebody else. I was just focused on getting Greg to his appointments, getting his meds right, anticipating his needs, coordinating his schedule so that we weren't overrun with the many, many, many visitors that Greg welcomed with open arms, even when he could barely lift his arms. I was hoping and praying that even though I was forced to shift my attention from keeping Mary alive to keeping Greg alive, that she would be okay. And of course, I was running my business so that we could pay the bills because Greg was no longer working. I didn't have any time to absorb any spiritual awakenings. I was tired and I was often quite grumpy. In fact, someone described me as being perpetually pissed off. Meanwhile, Greg had mastered the total and complete uncertainty under which we all live, but it was magnified by his disease. And somehow, without ever losing his love for life, he mastered acceptance, and he turned it into radiant acquiescence, and he captured it in his favorite phrase, cheerfully repeated. Lesson number 4. It is what it is. Now, Greg was an amazing musician and composer, but not many of us know that he was actually a really good writer as well. He was a gifted writer. And in those last years, he spent time writing wonderful stories from his life, such as the story that I told you about how he saved or tried to save Mani's soul. It was an unwitting strategy, but it served him well. While living with cancer, Greg leaned into his creativity like he never had before. And the arena, of course, of his creativity that shone brighter than ever before was his music. You know, he actually created and staged 5 shows in those 4 years of cancer. He directed the choir from his wheelchair and using us, his loved ones, particularly Rachel, as his arms and legs. There were times during rehearsals that he was so wiped out by the cancer and by his treatment that he was making very little sense. And the cast would come to me with grave concern that he may not be able to get us through to the performance. Each time, I would say, you know what, it doesn't matter because this is keeping him alive. His last concert, to an audience of about 1,000 people, was held just 6 weeks before he died. And that concert was called From Our Hearts to Yours. On a personal note, when he announced his intentions to stage that show, Rachel and I, we weren't so thrilled. In fact, we were puzzled and slightly distraught. Greg was really quite ill by then. I mean, he didn't know it was 6 weeks before he died, but he was quite ill by then. And we wanted him to spend his last energy with us, not on putting together another production, because an enormous amount of energy goes into the behind-the-scenes work to put together a show. And it was work that would fall to Rachel and me, a lot of it. And then I got it. Greg just wanted to spend his last ounce of energy serving humanity with his creativity. And things got really, really strange and surreal after that. ABC Television did a segment on him for their 7:30 report, and they interviewed us at home and at the hospital and at the final rehearsal. It was almost as if we became part of a reality TV show, because we were even filmed when Kynan, his doctor, had the difficult task of actually telling us that the treatment was no longer working and we were out of options. And they filmed that. It was a really strange time. This was the twilight of Greg's life, but it was obvious to everyone, including the ABC television crew, that his light was shining brighter even though his body was so weak. I called him the cancer-improved Greg, and he loved that. He loved that title. In fact, at his last concert, when Greg addressed the audience at the end of the show, he shared how much gratitude he had for this adversity and how much it had changed him. And that's when he said, to my absolute horror, to 1,000 people, as I cringed, "You should all get cancer." So, 5 shows in those last 4 years, all delicately positioned between hospital stays and surgeries, and sometimes even during hospital stays. This photograph was taken right here, with Greg conducting one of our rehearsals when he was smuggled out of hospital to conduct the choir that night. But most importantly, all of this was using that magical thing inside of him, which was creativity. And that creativity really seemed to work its magic, extending his life. It was almost as if the cancer cells were being scared away by his creativity. And I think in doing so, Greg, without realizing it, had discovered a lesson that I have learned in my own life as an artist, and in the lives of thousands of my students that I've seen happen, and also in my own in our daughter's life, Mary's life. That whether it's writing, sewing, knitting, cooking, photography, gardening, making pots, painting, or as it was for Greg, making music, our creativity is a light that can light the way during periods of adversity. And that's lesson number 5. Now, when I think of Greg's qualities, consistent over the entire period of his life, one of the first words that spring to my mind is valor. Now, what is valor? Valor is courage and boldness, but associated most particularly with battle. And this started at a very young age, because Greg, as I told you, had a volatile temper. And when he got mad, his loud voice and his fearsome scowl and his unnatural strength made him quite intimidating, particularly before age and maturity, and of course his lovely wife softened him. So I asked him once if he'd ever gotten into a physical fight with anyone. This wasn't inconceivable, because Greg grew up in a fairly rough, hard-drinking neighborhood, and beer and testosterone are a potent combination. He told me, in fact, a number of times that just about all of his mates from his younger days either end up dead or in prison or both. And to my surprise, he said no, he had never gotten into a physical fight with anyone. He always managed to walk away. And then he told me this hilarious story of what happened when he was just a teenager. By this time, he had already gotten a reputation in the neighborhood as someone not to be messed with. One night, he got into an argument with 2 young men. And these guys were big and tough and fueled by too much booze and no brains. And then one of them pulled a knife on him. And Greg did what any sensible, short person would do when faced with 2 tall, angry, armed blokes at night. He turned and ran. He ran and ran and ran and ran, and they chased and chased and chased, and Greg was a fast runner, so he thought that he could outrun them. And then he found himself in an alleyway facing a wall with nowhere to go. A dead end. So he turned around to face his assailants, 2 angry young men, bigger than him, and a knife. And what did he do? He started walking towards them. And what happened next defies explanation, but it makes sense if you've ever seen Greg angry. They took one look at him and turned and ran. Now we're going to fast forward 40 years. Cancer had replaced the streets of Bentley as Greg's battlefield. And one of Greg's first reactions to his terminal cancer diagnosis was, I'm going to climb Bluff Knoll. Now, Bluff Knoll is the highest peak in the Stirling Ranges, and it's one of the highest peaks in Western Australia. Now, bear in mind, Greg was wheelchair-bound at this time. And then he spent most of the 4 cancer years on hardcore cancer drugs and their horrible side effects. He had many surgeries, and when not in a wheelchair, he was on crutches at the best of times, or crutches or a walking stick at the best of times. To be able to climb Bluff Knoll was almost a ridiculous dream. But about 2 years into his illness, when he was theoretically supposed to be dead, through a strange combination of a dream, an actual dream that I had, and Greg's risk-taking behavior, and his surgeon's surprising willingness to invest in giving a dying man a very, very complex, total hip reconstruction, Greg did it. He was helped by very strong younger brother, Michael, and his brother-in-law, Greg, who never left his side, as well as dozens of well-wishers. This climb was very symbolic for Greg. It was a journey rich with metaphor. And one unexpected source of metaphor was the weather. Despite the fact that it was summer and it was quite warm when they started, as they climbed, the skies darkened and clouds gathered. But they kept going. The wind picked up, and then it started to rain. And pretty soon there was thunder and lightning. So at this point, Greg picks up his walking stick, points it to the sky, and yells, "Is that all you've got? Bring it on!" Now, every now and then when we yell at God, he replies in no uncertain terms. It started to hail. In summer in Western Australia. Greg was exhilarated by this, and the party of well-wishers and Greg, they carried on, they climbed on. Greg had done this climb many times before. The healthy Greg took about 2 hours to do the climb, and it took him 7 hours, but he did it. Every single human being, as long as we're alive, we will face, and we face, sorrow and adversity, and sometimes unbearable sorrow. And in order to make sense of the adversity in my own life, I've derived great comfort from this advice from Baha'u'llah about how we should reflect on our trials. O Son of Man, my calamity is my providence. Outwardly it is fire and vengeance, but inwardly it is light and mercy. Now, what is providence? Providence is actually defined as the protective care of God. So, think about it. Calamity equals the protective care of God. Now, that's pretty weird, all well and good, astounding as it may seem, but the next bit, it gets worse. It's even more astounding, slightly horrifying, actually. Baha'u'llah advises us to hasten thereunto that thou mayest become an eternal light and an immortal spirit. This is my command unto thee. Do thou observe it. But now, when I read those words, hasten thereunto that thou mayest become an eternal light and an immortal spirit, I think of Greg walking towards those tough guys with the knife. I think of him climbing that mountain, undaunted by wind and rain and lightning and then hail, instead hastening unto it. And so I think he was teaching us what I have deemed lesson number 6. When we are faced with calamity, walk towards it and go, bring it on. So clearly, Greg's life was one of faith and devotion and creativity and courage and many, many admirable qualities. But, and there's a big but, it was also a life of extremes that lacked balance and inner harmony until cancer forced it upon him. And just between us, there were many, many things that I wish he didn't do. The most obvious thing, of course, was to get sick and die. Greg was a risk taker. In those crazy years, when I counseled Greg to rest, he said once to me, "I'll rest when I die." And those were prophetic words indeed. Until it was too late, Greg forgot his health and he wasn't present to his well-being. I think Greg lived his life like a burning meteor. It was brief and fiery, and it was very difficult not to get burned by it. And I know that there are probably some amongst us tonight that have awfully busy lives. Perhaps you feel like you are juggling a great many balls. Perhaps all that busyness is a badge of honor for you, like it was for Greg. Perhaps our bodies suffer. Perhaps our mental health becomes a bit compromised. Maybe our families don't see very much of us. We might find ourselves so absorbed in what is urgent that we forget what is important. We live in turbulent times, and our own inner life and private character can mirror that turbulence, or we can choose a different way. So how about this instead? How about we take really good care of our one precious life, our one precious body, the temple of our souls? How about as we answer that inner drive we have to change the world in whatever way we choose to, we also strive to have robust mental and physical health, to have wholesome relationships with those that we love? How about we change the world with outward service as well as with inner balance and harmony, a physical and a spiritual transformation? Because transformation can accelerate as a result of cancer and incredible adversity, as it did for Greg, or it can move forward gently with consistent steps in self-care and understanding our physical, our mental, our emotional limits and getting help when we need it. So how about this? How about we try and live our lives with lesson number 7. We show up strong and vital in our body, mind, and spirit, and where possible, we stay alive. Now, Baha'is live by some very interesting laws. We already know how Greg dealt with the no alcohol law by going out and getting plastered. But there are some laws that are just not for the individual's well-being, but for the stability of society as a whole. And one of these laws, one of these kinds of laws, is that every Baha'i has to write their last will and testament. Now, Greg, as some of us here know, liked to leave things to the very last minute. So one of Greg's very last acts on this world was to obey this law and write his last will and testament. He spent many, many days writing it. I was really perplexed as to why he took so long over this. I mean, how long does it actually take to write, "I leave all my worldly possessions to my wife, Malini Parker"? But seriously, there's a very good reason why he took so long. You see, a Baha'i will is not just a legal document that shows who you give your stuff to. It's a declaration of your beliefs, a statement of how you would like your remains to be treated. Baha'is are counseled in our Book of Laws that we should begin our will and testament by making mention, as he may wish, of that which is praiseworthy. Now, this is a fairly broad statement, and Greg chose to do it like this, by leaving a message to the community that had nurtured his growth and put up with him for 42 years, since those early firesides where he showed up arguing with everyone he met, and also a message to his long-suffering parents. It was his final way of saying how grateful he was for every part of his short life. So before I step away, let me share an excerpt from Greg's will. In Greg's words, "To my Baha'i brothers and sisters, your gatherings of unity over decades have refreshed my soul, and your loving prayers in these last years have left me overwhelmed with humble thanks. He gave me the gift of music. He inspired my soul to use that gift in serving humanity. Through him alone, I was honored with the precious bounty of being able to raise my voice in intimate gatherings and great assemblies and invite the people to the garden of unity. Through the promptings of him alone, I was impelled to utilize his gift for the spiritual education of children. How can I befittingly express my gratitude? Finally, I thank the All-Glorious for my loving parents. I enjoyed a happy childhood. They endured my tempestuous youth with patience and love. And truly, I would not have traded my upbringing for the world's treasures. How my soul rejoices at our reunion. My God, what tongue can voice my thanks to thee?" And so to me, Greg's final lesson was be thankful to the end. Greg died on May the 16th, 2014. It was the night that many Baha'is all over the world gathered for their 19-day feast, a gathering held in Baha'i communities everywhere, every 19 days. And so within minutes of Greg's passing, the news that he had gone was spread via text message from Padma's phone to the entire Baha'i community, and from there to many parts of the world. It was as if Greg died on a cloud of love, surrounded by his loved ones gathered in our home and around the world. I am grateful to have shared nearly 30 years with this unusual man. I am grateful to have learned so much about Australia, about the world, about the cosmos, about faith, about love and loyalty from him. I am grateful to have had the opportunity to sing by his side for thousands of people, for learning what it truly means to be of service to humanity, and in those last 4 years, to be of service to him. And finally, I am grateful, I am forever grateful, for the privilege of witnessing Greg's transformation as he progressed from living with valor to dying with nobility. I'll end with Abdu'l-Baha's words from the Baha'i writings. Anybody can be happy in the state of comfort, ease, health, success, pleasure, and joy. But if one will be happy and contented in the time of trouble, hardship, and prevailing disease, it is the proof of nobility. Thank you so much.